Okay, so it's about 4 past, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. I tried to mute everyone, but if you have your microphone or video is not as much of a problem, but if you have your microphone on, could you please mute that so that we don't have any crossing over? So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Trystan Harpold. I am a recent graduate of NMSU, or New Mexico State University, with a bachelor's degree in conservation ecology. I am also soon to be a master's student at the University of Missouri. And for my time at New Mexico State, I was also associated with the NMSU herbarium for about 3 years in various capacities, including as a volunteer, as an intern, and then eventually right now as an employee. And during that time with the NMSU herbarium, I was conducting the research that I will be presenting to you today. This research started in 2018, and I presented it a few times to the Native Plant Society, but the latest was in 2018. And since that time, this project has really evolved, and I was recently musing about how it essentially became a completely different project. So I kind of wanted to give an update to the project with a little bit of an extra spin to it. And that spin is I want to do kind of a primer with some case studies on invasive species and why we should care. And once we know, why should we care about these invasive species, slowly move into what the actual project is about and what we accomplished during the last 2 to 3 years that we were working on the project. So let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So there we go. So anytime I do a presentation like this, I really like to read this quote for the presentation because it's so poignant about the urgency of invasive species. And this quote is by Dr. E.O. Wooten. He was one of the original researchers and original teachers at New Mexico State University when it was just the Ag College. And he was a professor from 1819 to 1911, and he was also the founder of the NMSU herbarium. And this quote in particular is concerning a species named Salsola cali, or Salsola tragus, I believe it's a new name, but you guys might know it as either Russian thistle or tumbleweeds. And it's a native to Eurasia, and it is a major invasive species in New Mexico. I'm sure many of you have seen it, piled up against fence lines in the countryside, and how farmers sometimes have to burn giant piles of them because they become such an issue. So the quote goes as follows: "Kill it first, if possible, whatever it may be. Find out its name afterwards. There is but one treatment to recommend for it: utter extermination from New Mexico. And let me emphasize this statement: now, if ever, is the time to exterminate it. Place one in each schoolhouse so that the pupils may become familiar with it, and teach them to kill it wherever they find it, as they would kill a rattlesnake. There is but one conclusion to come to: kill it all, and now. Every interest you have in the future of the territory and every personal interest demands that you do what you can to exterminate it and never allow it to reappear. Destroy everyone you see, and see them all." Now, having said that, I do have to say I do not condone killing rattlesnakes, just invasive plant species. But as you can see, this quote is very emotionally charged, very passionate. So why? Well, first off, what is he speaking to when we talk about invasive species? And why would Salsola cali be an invasive species? Well, there are a few different definitions for an invasive species. There's invasive species, there's weeds, there's noxious weeds, and I'm sure there's a few other ones, but let's go into the definition of each of those terms, and I'll define why we chose invasive species for this presentation. So an invasive species is defined as an organism that is non-native to an ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm. So there are two components there. There's a non-native component, and then there's a causes environmental or economic harm. So what is a weed? A weed is any plant that grows in an unwanted place, especially a garden or a field. So that only has the one component of the environmental harm. It causes some kind of problem, but it's not necessarily non-native. And then finally, a noxious weed it's a term usually used by the federal government or by agricultural people in the agricultural industry, and it is any plant or plant product that can directly or indirectly injure or cause damage to crops, including nursery stock and plant products, livestock, poultry, etc. And so as you can see with that one, still not a non-native, but it causes a problem, but primarily for agricultural crops. And the reason we chose invasive species for this project is because the project mostly worked with horticultural species that were planted as ornamentals on the NMSU campus. And so that doesn't really include agriculture, and it's not necessarily just weeds. So we went with the invasive species, non-native, and it causes a problem. So the first component of that is it's a non-native. So how does a non-native species get here? Well, there are multiple different routes that it can enter into an area through. It can be introduced by horticulture, which is what we are looking at for this project, and that's for ornamental purposes, for planting in your yard. It can be introduced for agricultural purposes. It can be introduced for ecological restoration and protection. Introduced unintentionally on contaminated objects such as hiking boots, personal vehicles, or commercial vehicles. And you can see that here with this photo. Let me laser pointer. So you can see that in this photo, you see the seeds attached to this person's shoe. And I'm sure many of you have experienced getting grass burrs stuck in your socks or in your shoes. And not only are they annoying for your skin and for hiking, but they're also annoying for the environment. In addition, you can also get species like this in contaminated soil, hay, and other materials. A good example of this in hay and also reseeding materials is there's a species called Bromus tectorum, or common name is cheatgrass, and that species is a major issue in the forests of, well, the Sacramento Mountains, the Gila National Forest, Santa Fe National Forest, our Sky Island Forest, because when those forests burn, they often non-traditionally, they burn too hot and burn really large areas. And so you need something to stabilize those areas that are burned. And the Forest Service will oftentimes use native seeds, and they will use hay to keep that soil down and keep it from eroding. But the seeds of cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum, are very, very difficult to pull out of that seed, those bag of seeds they drop in the hay. And so oftentimes they'll try and stabilize the area and then introduce this invasive, which can then cause the forest not to regrow due to changing fire regimes, which I'll discuss later in the presentation. Another good example of an invasive species for multiple of these reasons is the one you see right here called kudzu. And kudzu is a vine-like plant that was introduced in 1883 as an ornamental for erosion control, for fertilizer, and for livestock feed. However, we soon found out that it can get very quickly out of control, and it can potentially cover entire buildings, entire trees, and end up killing the trees. For example, you can see right here in the background on this photo, you can see these trees completely covered with it, and then this back here is a building that was covered by kudzu. And the way that it kills is, I'm sure you know that plants really need sunlight to grow. That's their main thing, one of the main things they need. Well, you can't get sunlight if something is shading you over, covering you up. And with how much biomass you see right over here, with how much plant you see, it also takes up a lot of nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen. And so it can crowd it out from taking up too much sunlight and taking up nutrients. Okay. So why do we care? We saw in that last slide a few of the negative effects of it. For example, the kudzu killing out plants and then covering houses. But what are some other reasons? One of them is that it can compete with native species, such as the trees in that last photo. It can exclude native species through competition for nutrients or sunlight. They can alter composition and structure of ecosystems. They can alter fire disturbance regimes, which I mentioned that in speaking on cloud-cropped in our forests. But what is a fire regime? Well, a fire regime is essentially composed of two parts. It's the frequency intensity of fires that normally go through an area. And you can have, normally it's talked about in a traditional sense. So for example, traditionally, the forests up near Cloudcroft have very frequent fires every 5 to 10 years. And they're very low intensity fires, meaning they stay on the forest floor, they don't get into the tree canopy, and they just burn out that understory. But that's the traditional fire regime, and those regimes are slowly shifting to a non-traditional fire regime where you have high intensity, less frequent fires, which causes a shift in the ecosystem that's not necessarily desirable. Another effect of these invasive species is that it can alter the hydrologic cycle or water cycle, meaning that certain invasive species, such as the salt cedar right here, can take up more water than other species and can keep them from getting that water. And then finally, these invasive species can often decrease the biodiversity and species richness of an ecosystem. Salt cedar is another good example of this. When salt cedar takes over like it does in this photo, it can often reduce the diversity of bird species and mammal species that can grow in that area, and it reduces plant species. And along the lines of with salt cedar, it's one of the worst ones in the state because it also causes a change in fire disturbance regimes. As you can see here, this firefighter fighting a wildland fire in this area, and salt cedar often regrows much drier and much faster than species such as cottonwoods and willows that normally grow in these areas. And when it has a fire like this, it will kill those species, and then the salt cedar will keep them from regrowing because of the fire regime. So now that we know some of the issues, what are some good examples of invasive species from New Mexico? Well, the first one I will cover is Siberian elm, or Ulmus pumila. Many of you might have this in your backyards. I know I had it in my backyard when I was growing up in Clovis, New Mexico. We had a line of them along the fence. They are a small, fast-growing tree native to northern China, Siberia, Manchuria, and they are listed as a Class C weed in New Mexico by the New Mexico Department of Agriculture. They were originally brought here as windbreak, soil erosion control, and for livestock production. However, they now have also become an ornamental just because they are nice looking trees. So the problem with this species is that it may exclude understory plants due to a process called allelopathy, and I'll cover that in the next slide. It also invades dry and mesic prairies, including sand prairies, which if you need a mental image, those are kind of the prairies that we see over near Clovis, New Mexico and Roswell, New Mexico. They take over these areas due to their drought and wind tolerance, and they can also form thickets that invade native shade-intolerant species and cause an invasion of other shade-tolerant exotics. So it's kind of like a positive feedback loop where you get this, it kills other stuff, and other stuff invades. So you have two invasives instead of just one. Now, a minute ago, I mentioned allelopathy, and I'd like to cover this a little bit, or in a little bit more detail. So allelopathy can be both positive and negative. However, in the context of invasive species, I like to just define it as when plants attack. Now, I know this sounds ridiculous, but it's surprisingly interesting how plants can attack other plants. The actual definition of allelopathy refers to the beneficial or harmful effects of one plant on another plant, both crop and weed species, from the release of biochemicals. And invasive species often have this trait, and there are also some native species that have this trait. For example, two invasives that we will talk about, the one that I just talked about, and Tree of Heaven, or Ailanthus altissima, has this trait. And two natives that you might not know have this trait are Creeish soapbush and black walnut. And the way there are multiple methods by which plants can release these chemicals. The main way is through putting these chemicals into the soil directly through root exudation. They can also put these chemicals into the ground through the decomposition of leaves. So the chemical is inside the leaves, and as it decomposes, those chemicals get into the ground. Another way is through leaching. So rain droplets or snow runs onto the leaves, picks up the chemicals, and then drops them on the ground, and then they percolate down into the ground. And then a more interesting way that they can do this is through any of those methods. However, the initial chemical they put into the ground might not be harmful to other plants, but there is some kind of microbial transformation that happens where a microbe transforms this chemical that's normally not harmful to other plants into a chemical that is harmful to other plants. So there's an intermediate step there, and it's kind of interesting. So as I said, another example of an allelopathic plant is the tree of heaven, or Ailanthus altissima. It is a medium-sized tree native to China and introduced to the United States in 1784 as an horticultural species. It is also listed as a Class C weed in New Mexico. It's primarily invasive in the eastern United States because of the amount of water they get. However, it can be invasive in New Mexico and in the Southwest because our riparian zones do have enough moisture to be invaded. And a riparian zone is just a word for the area to either side of a water course or river. So, for example, if you've ever been down to the Rio Grande and you see that the vegetation changes between the desert and the floodplain and then some of the trees closer, that floodplain and the closer trees, they're often different species of trees, different amounts of trees, higher biomass, and more animal species. There are many differences between riparian areas and other areas, but those areas that you see by the Rio Grande are an example of a riparian area. And so these trees invade those areas primarily in urban riparian areas. So for example, where the Rio Grande crosses or comes through Las Cruces, where the city of Las Cruces and the Rio Grande are adjoining, that's a prime area where this tree might become invasive. The reason it becomes invasive is because it interferes with the growth of native species for competition for light and nutrients, and as I mentioned, that allelopathy. It also has the potential to alter stem structure and key ecosystem processes, primarily in these urban riparian areas. So a final example of an invasive species in New Mexico is the salt cedar, or Tamarixpa. And this is actually a group of medium to large trees native to Europe and North Africa and Asia. It's a group of 3 to 4 species, maybe 5, that are in the genus Tamarix, and all of them are listed as a Class C weed in New Mexico. The reason they're invasive is because they exclude native species in the riparian areas, such as in the Rio Grande, and this is due to their high drought tolerance, high salinity tolerance, high water consumption, and its resprouting ability. One of the main problems with this species is that it's often associated with major ecological changes, and that's just to say that these trees are often found in areas that are experiencing major ecological changes, and the research we're seeing is that we can't tell yet if these trees are causing the ecological changes or if they are just entering due to the ecological changes, and the ecological changes are caused by something we're doing or something climate related. But we can say we can say with relative certainty that they are at least exacerbating already common problems that we're having, such as low water levels in the Rio Grande River, changes in fire regimes, issues like that. And so the ecological changes you might see are changes in soil salinity, fire regimes, as I mentioned, plant community composition, wildlife density and diversity, and hydrology. So these trees can often take water away from other plants. They have a high water consumption. And finally, they're very, very difficult to get rid of. And this is partially due to that resprouting ability I mentioned, but also because of the fact that when they are put under some kind of stress, including removal stress, such as fire, cutting, or herbicide, they also often jump straight to flower and seed production. And so you can cut out all of those plants, but then next year those new seeds will have sprouted and you'll have the same problem all over again. And so that coupled with the resprouting ability makes this very, very difficult to get rid of. And really the only way to get rid of it is to do 2 of the 3 methods that are listed right there, fire, cutting, or herbicide. So you have to use at least 2 of those to get rid of it. So I discussed a few, like some of the reasons why these species are such a problem, what issues they cause. So what can we do about it as community members and as scientists? Well, one of the primary ways, and what this research talks a little bit about, is we can landscape with native species. So if the university is changing their landscaping, they're making a new building, they can put in native species instead of exotics. If you are redoing your yard, you can decide to put in drought-tolerant native species rather than a grass lawn and water-consuming plants. And in doing that, you don't necessarily have to give up beauty. You don't have to give up a nice yard to play in or to relax in. For example, if you look at this picture here, this is on the NMSU campus at Hardeman Jacobs Learning Center. And as you can see, it's really not, it's a very beautiful area. And you can imagine having a bench right here and just relaxing on a nice summer day with maybe an awning over you so you don't get sunburnt, but it seems like a really nice place to relax. Another way that we can help combat invasive species is to recognize and pull invasive species. And that's not to say that we should pull everything we see. We have to be very careful that we are targeting just the species that we know are invasive. One of the examples I like to use of this is this species right here called Linaria dalmatica, or Dalmatian toadflax. It is an invasive species in our Sky Island areas, such as Cloudcroft. There's a lot of it also near Flagstaff, Arizona, and then Santa Fe and in the Gila National Forest. The reason I like it so much is because it's very easy to identify. It has these beautiful yellow flowers and this nice spike that comes off, or spur that comes off the end. It has very recognizable leathery leaves, a very, very succulent stem, and it has this characteristic growth pattern. And one of the main reasons I like this one as an example is because it's almost fun to pull up, because you can get the entire root system in one pool. There's a lot of them, so you can basically go nuts. So if you need some kind of anger management, this might be a good option if you're traveling through the forest and you see these. Another way that you can help with reducing invasive species is to clean boots and vehicles before traveling to new areas. Say you just got done going mudding in Cloudcroft in your new Jeep and you had a lot of fun. You get mud all over your car and you have seeds in that mud, but you don't notice them. Before you decide to go, say, up to Santa Fe for another trip, or before you decide, to take a cross-country vacation trip, consider cleaning your vehicle, cleaning all of your boots and stuff, and make sure that those seeds are no longer on your vehicle or in your luggage. And then finally, the last thing that we can do to combat these invasive species is to do research and learn as much about them as possible. We can ask questions such as which species are invasive and which ones are important, which methods are most economical and effective, how are new species being introduced, how do we predict the invasiveness of a species, and how do we prevent invasive species from being introduced. And it's these kind of questions that really led to the project that I will cover in the next half of this presentation. We were really wanting to answer questions such as, how do we reduce the number of invasives we're getting? Are they being introduced through horticulture? Are they being introduced in Las Cruces? So for this project, it originally began with the woody ornamental, or the list and key to the woody ornamental plants of the NMSU campus. And this list was created by Dr. Kelly Allred, and it was last updated in 2012. So our original plan was just to update the names in the key and list and to figure out what needed to be removed and what needed to be added. Once we had a general idea of what we were doing with that, we also decided to evaluate what natives and exotics were on campus and what invasive species are on campus. Then we moved to compiling fact sheets that we could share with the NMSU campus and with the community of Las Cruces. And then finally, we wanted to analyze the sustainability of the plants on the NMSU campus. So for this project, we really had 6 primary parts, and those were broken down each into their own sections. So I'll go over the primary parts, and then I'll come back and go into more specifics. The first part was just our introduction here, where we essentially decided what do we have in the key and list, what do we need to do with it, and what are our next steps. Once we figured all of that out and got our compilation of totals together, we also needed to do what I would call an evidence collecting section, and this is creating herbarium vouchers and photo vouchers. And this is important because we have to have physical evidence that that plant is on campus and that it is X, Y, and Z. It is invasive, it's this, that, and the other thing. So then from there, once we have that information, we split it into 3 other parts. We used the key and list here to create a species richness study. Then we also used a transect study, which I will explain here in a second. This transect study we used to analyze abundance, which is a little bit different from species richness, and I'll cover that in the transect part. And then our final section was to investigate the actual sustainability of campus, such as what invasives there are and what the water consumption is. And then finally, we came back and compiled all of this information and put it into graphs and considered the implications. So let's break down each of these steps individually. So we start with the provisional key to the woody ornamental plants. We investigate what new plants need to be added and what plants need to be added and what plants need to be removed. Sorry, I got a little caught off guard with the questions. I will just, if you have questions, just enter them in the group chat and I will try and get to them at the end of the presentation so that we don't get a little sidetracked. So once we had what we need to add and remove, we cross-checked or cross-referenced and annotated the species names, and that just means we updated them to their latest botanical name, because a lot of these species, the names change, especially in groups that are in fluctuation taxonomically. So we got those new names up to date, and then we kind of branched off into this evidence collecting section where we did physical herbarium vouchers, and we needed at least one physical voucher per species. Then from there, we decided to try and do photo vouchers, and that's essentially going and taking photos of every single individual on campus. And that is still something that we really need, but it is a very, very large part of the project, and we didn't actually get through the entire that section of the project. We think we got about 10% of the campus done, but that's hopefully for the future. So after we got as much of that as we could, we did a compilation of totals for the diversity on campus, what orders, family, genera, and species are, how many are present on campus and what they are, and then we split into these other 3 sections. So the first section was the species richness, and for the species richness, we determined the origin of the species using the key and list, and once we had that origin, we could decide, is it invasive, or is it native, or is it exotic? Once we had those numbers, we can calculate the total and percentages and say, oh, we have this number of this number of exotics and this percentage of exotics. Then we split off and did a species abundance study. Now, the difference between species richness, I'll have to go to this next slide. Species richness is different than abundance. So species richness, if you look here for this transect, a transect is essentially a rectangle that we set down somewhere on campus and randomize that the area we placed it, and then we count every single individual and every species that we find within that transect. And for this project, our transects were 40 meters long by 1 meter wide, and you can see that as a picture right here. So this measuring tape right here is the center of our transect, and then this is half a meter away from our boundary, which is this orange piece of rope. Now, for this transect study, to do, as I mentioned, randomization, that's why we did the transect. Another aspect of randomizing is to create controls, and for our controls, we decided to do 3 what we call biomes for campus, and the 3 biomes we chose was a desert biome, which composed mainly of rocks and had drought-tolerant plants and I would say, well, we found out later on that they were native plants, but we didn't know that at the time. We chose park biomes, which as you can see here is mostly grass with some sparsely placed trees and just nice places to go around. And these are what most of the campus is created out of. And then we had concrete biomes, which is rocky areas that are not necessarily drought tolerant plants, but they are surrounded by concrete barriers and are often on the side of parking lots and walking areas. So once we had these biomes, we randomized them. And now coming back to species richness and species abundance, the reason we did this transect study is because it can tell us about species abundance. Species richness is when we look at the number of species we have. And so, for example, say this green one in this transect, these green ones are native species, is one native species. And we have this red one is one exotic species. Well, if you look at that from species richness, you might say, oh, that's a 1-to-1 ratio, so 50% are native, 50% are exotic. But if you look at species abundance, you have to count each individual. And so we can see here from abundance, we have 6 invasive or 6 exotic species and 2 native species. And so that changes things. That changes it. We have a 3-to-1 ratio of exotic species to native species. And both of these measures are important and tell us different information. So we had to use both of them. So coming back to our flow chart here, first for the transect study, we determined the biomes and the definitions for those. We randomized where we placed the transects. We actually conducted the study, and then we got all our results and analyzed the statistical analyses for those. Then coming back here to our third prong of our flowchart, we looked at sustainability. So first we investigated what's the water consumption on the NMSU campus, what species out of the key in list were considered invasive by state and federal authorities, what plants, how do we choose what plants we're going to suggest, and then we actually choose the species that we wanted to suggest. And just real quickly to this question I just got, the definition of a native species that we used for this project was a native species is anything that grows in New Mexico. And part of the reason we did that is because it's, as some of you might know, New Mexico has pretty much I believe it's every single biome type in the world except for jungle biome. And that is an important distinction because, as you mentioned in that question, the Chihuahuan Desert is going to be different than, say, the species up in Cloudcroft. However, we do not have an easy way of obtaining that data, and it would take a lot of work to figure out where exactly those species are native to. And so we decided with the information we had, we were going to use just New Mexico species, and moving into Chihuahuan Desert species is hopefully possibly for the future of the project, but for this part of the project, it was a little bit too much of a reach because that information isn't readily available. It would take a lot of research literature-wise. So the definition is just essentially, did the species occur in New Mexico prior to settlement by Europeans? So now going back to, we finished our third prong here, and then once we get all of this information, we compile the data and interpret it. We create graphs and visualizations like you'll see here, and then we consider the implications and decide where do we want to go in the future, and then also present the results in venues like this and at conferences. So going past this is our materials, the transect, as I mentioned, some other materials we used, the provisional key to the woody ornamental plants of the NMSU campus. Other materials, some online resources we used the USDA Plants website, which is a very good resource, not just for scientists, but also for community members. It tells you, they list in here different species of plants by both scientific name and common name, and they list, as you can see in this map, where they're native to, and if they're in an area, if they're introduced to that area. There are sometimes there are facts right here where it says characteristics, and it will tell you other important aspects of the plant, such as water consumption, soil tolerance, salinity tolerance, important information like that. And we used this website partially to determine if it was native or exotic. For this resource, which is called Tropicos, this is a website that is hosted by the Missouri Botanical Garden, which is one of the largest, or has one of the largest herbaria in the United States and North America. This website it holds all, not, I wouldn't say all because research is always ongoing, finding new stuff, but it holds, it says right there, 1.3 million scientific names and what the most up-to-date scientific names are. So when we were going through the key and list to figure out what's the latest name, we use this website and just type in the name and it shows, oh, so this name isn't new, we need to change it to this newer name that scientists have decided on. And then finally, one of our last website resources we used was a site called SciNet, and this resource is essentially a compilation of the different herbaria in North America and particularly in the Southwest. And so through this site, we can look up records for herbarium specimens from many, many different herbaria. And so it also includes herbaria specimens, photos of the specimens. The NMSU herbarium does not have photos on there yet, but we're currently in the process of doing that, and that's quite an exciting project. So hopefully we can move that forward to get that information to help projects like this one. But this site also includes photos in situ, or in that actually growing in the area of these plants. And so this site allows us to actually identify what plants we have on campus, because sometimes, and this kind of touches on what this last question I just got, sometimes on campus, well, not sometimes, almost all the time, you have species from many, many different parts of the world. And that can be a problem because when a botanist tries to identify a plant, one of the first thing you go to is, where is the plant native to? Where is this plant at? And you can really shrink down the size from, you have a million options for different plants down to a smaller amount of plants. But on campus, you have plants from all over the world. And so you can have a very difficult time finding what the plant is, because we can't look at that plant and say, oh, we know it comes from China, so check the literature and the research from China. We have to actually go to sites like SciNet to do the research and figure out where those species actually come from. So moving on to some results, we actually found that a lot of species on campus, that the campus is highly biodiverse. There are about 49 families, 100 genera, and 165 taxa or species. However, we also found that about 10% of campus has not been, or 10% of the plants on campus have not actually been added to the key in list. For this project, we did, as I mentioned, the photo vouchering. However, we only did mainly this part of campus. And so we still need to, we hope to, in future iterations of this project, we hope to do areas like this and across here. So we have about 10% of the plants on campus that haven't been added to the list. Further results we found in the key in list for species richness, 78% of species are exotic and 22% are native, which is a really bad sign. And these numbers are also mirrored in the abundance study we did with the transects. With the transect study, we also found other really interesting information. As I mentioned, we did those different biomes, and we found that there's a significant difference between the biomes. You can see concrete biomes right here have 100% exotic species. The park biomes have 88% exotic species, and the desert biomes have 53% exotic species. So we can tell that the desert biome is way better for native species than these other two biomes are. And part of the reason this is important is because a lot of the new areas on the NMSU campus are, the NMSU campus, or the administration is moving more towards desert biomes. For example, this photo right here, as I mentioned, is from Hardman Jacobs Learning Center. That was built in the last 5 to 10 years, and that was one of our primary areas with desert biomes. We also found desert biomes around the new dorm rooms that are being constructed. And the last time I was on campus, I noticed there was some new construction going on, and it appeared that they were also using desert biomes in those new construction areas, such as by the new art building that they're building. As far as sustainability goes, we found that NMSU uses about 700,000 gallons of water a month just for watering the landscape of NMSU, and in peak months we actually get 2 million gallons of water. And to give you a visualization of that, you can see here this Olympic-sized swimming pool. An Olympic-sized swimming pool is about 600,000 gallons of water. So we use about a little more than one Olympic-sized swimming pool a month, or in peak months, we use between 3 and 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools just to water the plants on campus. We also found that there are about 8 species on campus that are listed as invasive by governmental agencies. All 3 of the case study species I did previously in the presentation, all 3 of those are found on campus, including the salt cedar. Some of the plants on campus are also really bad for water consumption. Just 3 quick ones that we randomly chose were crepe myrtles, southern magnolias, and white mulberries, and all 3 of those had water consumption 5 times higher than the average precipitation for the Las Cruces area. And that tells us tangentially, so we can't say for sure, we can't say, oh, if we have this many exotic species, we have this much water consumption, and if we go to natives, we'll have this much water consumption. We don't have the information for that as much as we'd like to, but if we see species with water consumption 5 times higher than precipitation, we know there is some of that has to be coming from supplemental watering. So we can say that these species, if we remove them and put in native species, we'd have 4 times lower water consumption. The vast majority of plants on campus are non-native, as I mentioned in the last slide, and then many of these species are not drought tolerant. And this is an important point to highlight because these species, the reason it's important they're drought tolerant is because they have different adaptations that you can see up here that help them conserve water. Some of them have very long root structures, and some of them can retain water in their stems, such as cacti. And a lot of our grasses are in the same way, have deeper root systems. And you can see why these lawns in Las Cruces and on the MSU campus aren't very good for drought tolerance. Because if you look over here, it's hard to see this grass right here, but it's Kentucky bluegrass, and it's the grass we mostly use for lawns in many parts of the country, including Las Cruces. But as you can see, the root system is almost non-existent for this species, meaning that it's going to need a lot more water to survive in the desert. So moving on to some suggested replacements and some outreach, we found a handful of plants that you can see here that are have very beautiful flowers, are very beautiful plants that we could plant on campus and in the Las Cruces community that don't take away from the beauty of the lawn, but are more drought tolerant and are natives. And we hope to move from just, showing nice, pretty pictures to hopefully creating these plaques like this to hand out to the NMSU administration and to community members in Las Cruces. And these plaques will just show, pictures of how nice the plants are, and then what the plant is and other information that's important for growing those plants. So some conclusions we came to: there is significant room for improvement on the NMSU campus, and that leads us to believe there is a lot of room for improvement in Las Cruces. NMSU has already begun transitioning to xeriscaping in desert plants, but only about 47% of those plants are native. They may be drought tolerant and they may be xeriscaping, but they aren't native plants. And although xeriscaping with non-natives is better than not xeriscaping, it's not as good as xeriscaping with natives. The results of this study can also be used for outreach, both at NMSU with the grounds crew and to the citizens of Las Cruces. A good example of this is the presentation we had last month with Professor Rachel Giannini, who is working on the new botanical garden. And we hope that we can use the results of this study to reach out to individuals like her and suggest, would you consider using this plant rather than this plant? And hopefully doing that method as we build new things on campus, we can gradually move to a more sustainable NMSU campus. And then finally, we know that many of the species, native species, have the potential to be planted on the NMSU campus and in Las Cruces. For example, we know already of one. It's not exactly a botanical garden, it's just a regular garden that's near Foster Hall on the NMSU campus. And aside from some much needed maintenance, it is completely native species, and it is a very nice place to be able to sit and enjoy the day, just the stuff you would do in your yard. And they're all native species. So we know that they can grow, and we know that it would be better if we would grow them. So here are some of my sources, and I'd like to wrap up by giving a special thanks to Dr. Sara Fuentes-Soriano and Professor Zachary Rogers for their input, guidance, and making this project possible. I could not have done this project without their help, and it wouldn't have even been conceived probably without their help. And I just want to thank them for all of their lasting guidance and help, and pushing me even when I was getting stuck in the mud, turning my wheels, and getting stuck with coursework and all the stuff that you have to deal with for research. So thanks to them for their lasting support. I'd also like to thank Dr. Kelly Allred for his use of his provisional key, to Dr. Acacia Feist for helping create the survey design for the transects and for helping conduct the statistical analyses, and then to Dr. Kristen Waring for her help with the statistical analyses. And support for this project was provided by the NMSU Herbarium and the National Science Foundation. Yes, I could go back to the sources page. Let me know if you need to go to the next one. And if you want to put questions down in the group chat, I'm going to start with the ones I got during the chat during the presentation that I didn't answer. How can we get that list for the woody plants on the NMSU campus? Is it available as a PDF? It is available right now as a Word document, and the updated version is a Word document, but it can be converted to a PDF. If you want, you can put your email in the comments, and I can send you an email with that key and list. Let me go get a pen and pencil if you want to do that. And so, yeah, that is readily available if you would like to use it. The next question, do you consider a native plant species brought from a local nursery the same as native, since you really don't know the province? No, in those cases, most of the time, since most of the plants on the NMSU campus, if not all of them, are from nurseries, we actually have to identify the species of that plant and figure out where it came from. And in cases, we did have a few cases in the transect study where we couldn't identify it, or we couldn't figure out where it was from. And in those cases, we completely omitted it because it would create a bias in our sample to decide, oh, it's one or the other. So we really try to figure out exactly where it is from. And with regards to, you mentioned Dr. Rolston St. Hilaire, we have chatted with him a little bit on this project, and he's helped to an extent with the project, and we've worked with him trying to figure out where some of the stuff is on campus. Yes, volunteer opportunities at the herbarium. So there are, so right now we aren't really doing any volunteer work just because of the COVID-19 situation, and most of the herbarium staff, myself included, are working from home right now. So we can't really do much volunteer work right now, but prior to this, we did have a lot of stuff that we were having volunteers do. Some of those opportunities include helping with taking photographs of specimens, helping with creating packets for plants, mounting plants. We have a huge backlog of plants. So if you are a crafty person that likes working with your hands, the herbarium has a lot of plants that need to be mounted once all of this is over. And we have a few other opportunities. We have a lot of stuff going on. So if you do want to volunteer, you can give me your email, and I can put you in contact with Dr. Fuentes. And well, if you see in the comment, actually, Dr. Fuentes and Professor Rogers actually put their email in the comments, so you can contact them. They're both the curators for the herbarium. So we have plenty of volunteer opportunities. Any more questions, comments? Let me write down these emails real quick. Okay, well, if you guys don't have, yeah, the question about the water consumption data. I actually found that from the NMSU website. Let me see if I can find the source. I don't remember if I put the source in this one. It was actually on one of the websites for NMSU, and it was where they were doing a water budget for the entire campus, talking about, you know, where the water goes, what water we need, and water rights, a lot of technical stuff like that. And I just happened upon it, and it showed a breakdown for that water consumption. Is the herbarium making outreach to the community to educate regarding invasive species? And Dr. Fuentes commented, yes, we are establishing collaboration with the sustainability group on campus. And we do have some with the connection with the Native Plant Society. And then also, hopefully through this project, we can continue that community outreach and get some of this information out to the public concerning native species and invasive species. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, then thank you all for coming to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you guys have a wonderful night, and talk with Rhonda Diaz at the Las Cruces Water Utilities. That's a great resource. I'll write that down and try and get in touch with them and try and see if we can get something going with this project.
I have a question.
Yes?
I have a few of the Siberian elms on our property, and there's little insects that eat the leaves continuously, little holes in the leaves, and the plants survive. But I guess I wonder if those insects are native, and if they provide birds and other species with, you know, food and stuff, if there's a use for them, or if those are also, you know, those could also be invasive. I don't know if you know anything about the insects.
I'm not very familiar with insects, and I would have to know exactly what it is, what species it is. But concerning birds eating them, regardless of whether they're invasive or not, a lot of birds, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of birds are not very picky with what they eat. So I would say they probably do provide some nutrition for birds, but I don't know if they would be native or invasive insects or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Use this for the Siberian elm. Okay.
Okay, so if there aren't any questions, more questions, like I said, you guys have a wonderful night. Thanks for coming to my presentation, and try and stay safe through this crazy time we're going through. So you guys have a wonderful night, and thanks for coming to my presentation. Say that, but oh, before I leave, yes, my email, before I exit out of this. Yeah, it might be easier if you email me asking for that list, if you don't mind. I might have trouble remembering to do that. This is my personal email.
If you recorded this, so
Yes, I
if
did.
we want to get it again, go over it, how do we do that?
I will, so after, if this has been recorded, I am planning to, I think the easiest way to do it is to put it on YouTube as a regular YouTube video, and then I'm going to send John and Carolyn the link for it. And so I'm assuming they will send that out in a newsletter or something along those lines. So you should be able to get a hold of it relatively easily on YouTube.
Okay. Okay.
Well, thank you guys, and you have a wonderful night.
Okay, thank you.